Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Let us discuss the fairness or justice of socialism versus capitalism. And right ahead, a remark that I want to make is that by capitalism, I would understand a free market. So I would use those interchangeably. So it's basically anarcho-capitalism. So it's the absolute absence of any sort of violent interruptions, right? So yeah, pretty much the free market. Whereas by socialism, I would understand any sort of interventionist doctrine like fascism or social democracy or whatever, interventionism, the kind of society we're living in today, etc. So some say that capitalism is unfair, because it's like a law of the jungle where only the strongest survives, etc. And it's kind of juxtaposed with socialism where apparently, supposedly, let's say, everyone is equal to each other, etc. So even the poor people might enjoy the life of wealth, apparently, or supposedly, just as well as filthy bourgeoisie of the past, so to speak. So it's fair because of that. So this is the statement we're gonna discuss in this video. But first of all, before we delve into this topic, I wish to make an important comment, I guess, is that Marxists themselves, actually, socialists themselves, or at least Marxists, because apparently not all socialists are Marxists, but that's debatable. But anyway, so people like Engels, for example, Friedrich Engels, said that justice itself, or fairness, or whatever, is also a social construct. So it depends on the way your culture is organized, right? It depends on your society, fundamentally. So what is considered fair in one type of society might be a complete demonic abomination in other type of society. And it's quite easy to think of some examples, but I wouldn't spend my time on that. So yeah, even Marxists actually admit that justice or fairness is subjective on the level of society, let's say, right? But we shall ignore this point and try to address this let's say contemporary account, let's say, of fairness, right? What we consider fair, which is more or less intuitively understandable for anyone, hopefully at least. So we'll just ignore this correct point that they make, I mean Marxists, and just start from a blank slate, so to speak. And we'll just assume that we know what is fair for the present day society, okay? So let us consider the situation where some abstract John, I actually wanted to make it abstract Jane, because again, abstract John is really someone who produces stuff, mostly. I mean, again, men are net taxpayers, so actually everything is run on money from men, whereas abstract Janes, they take money from the budget. But let's stick with abstract John. Let's pretend that he's a masculine presenting trans lesbian for the sake of this argument. So this abstract John, let's say he grows some cabbage, okay? Because why not? It's a cool occupation. I mean, if you don't agree, just try it and you'll see. And so interventionists / socialists might say, well, a wise ruler actually would know better how to, use this cabbage that John has grown. So let us just take it away from them, from him. So let us take all the cabbage, or at least some cabbage, away from John, and thus, if we do that repeatedly for many people, we have some pile of cabbage accumulated, I mean those wise rulers, so to speak, and they might decide what to do with it later, right? So That's the socialist approach. But is it fair? Like, think about it. Why should John give the cabbage that he produced to some random third person, some apparently wise ruler, you know? It doesn't seem obvious that he should, you know, in any sort of morality, I would say. So, okay, that's one point. But another point is that it's no different, obviously, than robbery. And of course, I've made this point many times before, and you've heard it probably from many libertarians before, that, you know, taxation is theft, as some say, or taxation is robbery, as I would claim is the more proper way of saying it, because, well, theft is something that is implemented, let's say, covertly, right? So theft is something in the shadows, so to speak. So somebody just steals your stuff from you while you're not noticing it, right? Whereas robbery, which I would claim is the proper term for taxation, is the open taking of your stuff away under the threat of violence, right? So if you don't pay your taxes, you're going to go to prison, so that's violence, or you're going to face some other bad consequences, let's say. So really, taxation is robbery, it's not a theft. If the government was taking your money away secretly, that would be theft. Although it does that too, I mean, by printing more money, for example, so by inflation, which lowers the value of your money in your pocket right now, even. Like as you're watching this video, your government prints more money, which makes you poorer. So maybe that would be a revelation for you, but hopefully not. I think you're smart enough to understand that this is the case. But anyway, in general, taxation is robbery. It's not theft, because it's conduced under the threat of violence, and it's completely open, right? So it's not theft, it's robbery. But okay, focused on that enough. So in pure socialism, you might say there would be 100% taxes, because, well, you would just take all the John's cabbage away from him, and you will just determine how much he deserves to receive back. Let's say that's this famous socialistic slogan, which I don't even know how to translate into English, but something to the effect of you should provide as much as you can, and you should receive as much as you need, or something to that effect, right? So the wise ruler, socialistic administrator, receives all that cabbage from everyone, and he delivers to the people as much as he thinks they need, right? That's what's happening fundamentally. Okay, so that's what they get in exchange, whatever the ruler would deem fair. And, well, you might say, as a counter-argument to that, well, the wise ruler probably gives them some good things in exchange, you know, like they build roads or schools or hospitals or something to that effect. But, you know, well, firstly, the ruling itself doesn't produce any good, any wealth by its own. It actually consumes wealth just for it to exist, you know, because those people are not producing anything. They're just redistributing stuff. So it's a burden on the whole society, right? So it's already a minus. And so, again, imagine a robber, like a guy robbing you, or a girl, let's say a girl, because, again, girls are underrepresented among robbers. So a girl robbing you and, like, taking your wallet, let's say, and going to a flower store and buying, using your money, a flower for you, and, like, returning this flower to you, like, in exchange for your wallet. Like, she says, take that, okay? Is that no longer a robbery? What happened? I mean, like, all of that, all of what government gives you is actually bought on your money. I mean, So is it still like, does it deny the previous robbery that took place before the government bought these things on your money? I don't think so, but maybe you think so. I don't know. Okay. Well, maybe, again, if your robber gives you a candy in exchange for your car or your wallet or whatever, maybe you would consider them no longer a robber. I don't know. Well, if you're a socialist, then definitely you should follow this logic, yeah. But okay. So, and it's quite interesting that Marx actually himself have fought this alienation, that basically people don't have rights to use the goods that they've produced, right? But instead, like in exchange, supposedly in capitalism, as he said, they don't. But the funny thing is that in a sort of a dialectic manner, he actually proposed to absolutize this tendency. And he said that, workers or whoever else, like whoever produces something, shouldn't have any rights at all at whatever for or over whatever they produce. So again, pure socialism is 100% taxes. So you lose everything you produce, and you only receive from the government whatever it deems necessary for you, right? So that's pure socialism, and that's like absolute alienation, I would say, right? So it's really peculiar how Marxism works with those categories of, let's say, freedom and liberty, or property and alienation, etc. So in effect, Marxism proposes to use absolute slavery, which is pure socialism, as a path to absolute freedom, which is communism. And again, like, I'm not sure, maybe I've mentioned it in my video about democracy versus liberalism, but I've had this idea that really communism and socialism are like polar opposites, because communism promises freedom, the absolute freedom, you're free of all the chains of the past, so to speak, your freedom of association, etc. Whereas socialism imposes absolute slavery, It says that you should do whatever the administration tells you to do, And it's pretty peculiar. And I'm not sure, but I think it was Marx's idea to follow this Hegelian logic, this absolutely stupid idea that if you go too far in one direction, you kind of get instantly teleported into the other direction. If you impose absolute slavery, you suddenly arrive at absolute freedom. It's this dialectic, this absolutely moronic, quasi-philosophical way of thinking. And so, for example, in Soviet realm or post-Soviet realm, you can find followers of those two radically different tendencies manifested as Trotskyists, for example, the followers of Leo Trotsky, versus Stalinists, followers of Stalin. And Trotskyists, you might say they are really liberals in the terms that I've used in my video about democracy versus liberalism. So they are about communism, about absolute freedom, whereas Stalinists are about socialism, that is absolute slavery, right? So as you can see, this fundamental divide kind of actually manifested politically, and it's no joke, actually. Even though Marx, again, if you read Marx, he says clearly, literally, and I can give you the quotes, that communism is not even a form of human society, it's just a tendency, how he calls it. So he proposes to arrive at communism, or rather move towards communism, that is absolute freedom through absolute slavery, through socialism. So it's a really interesting way of thinking, I would say. Okay, so, and what happens in market system with regards to this situation of John and cabbage? Well, you might say that John just simply offers the cabbage he produced to whoever is interested in buying it, or like exchanging it on something else, with perhaps using money as the intermediate way, like intermediate goods, let's say, right? I'll talk about money a little bit later, specifically, but yeah, in general, that's it. So, and this deal is voluntary, quite obviously, because nobody forces John to offer his cabbage to anyone. Nobody forces anyone to offer anything in exchange for the cabbage of John. I mean, they might not participate in this deal, right? So that's what happens on the free market. So there's no violence, and like somehow people think it's unfair and cruel. Like, how is it? Like, where is the unfairness here? Like, nobody forces anyone. Like, there's no violence. There's no, like, everything is voluntary. Those people want to do that. So where's the cruelty in that? I don't know. Well, some might say, well, what if John is a hired worker? What if he's not a farmer of his own? What if he works at a factory, let's say, and screws some bolts or whatever? Well, there's a couple of points I want to make about it. Well, the first point is that nobody actually forced him to work at this factory. So, I mean, if we have a free market, it means that it was also a contractual deal of John employing to this factory, right? Because, well, he deemed that the money he gets in exchange for his labor is better than his labor, I mean, for him. So he's ready to exchange his labor for money he would receive in exchange. And the same is true for the other side, for the employer, for the owner of the factory or whatever. Like, they deemed their money less, the money they give to John according to this deal, less valuable than the labor of John and his expertise, etc., that they get from him in exchange for this money, right? So it's also a voluntary deal from both sides. And, well, perhaps, well, I wanted to make here a couple of points, like various points about the failures of market, so to speak, but I don't really think it's related to the subject. But anyway, I just want to make a general point that most of the time, I would say actually all the time, when socialists blame anything on like they tag anything as a failure of the market, all the time they do that with regards to either natural phenomena or something like that, like oh, if you step out of the window, like you would fall down and break your neck. That's the clear failure of the market. We should regulate that. That's basically the logic of socialists. Or, oh, people get sick and die. Oh, that's the clear failure of the market. I mean, we should regulate that. We should ban cancer, because that would make it disappear, apparently. Well, because why not? I mean, you shouldn't have cancer, you bastard. We'll put you in jail if you get cancer. That's basically the logic of socialism in a nutshell, I would say. But okay, that's really not very related. But other things I wanted to talk about with regards to voluntary deals are those, for example, sweatshops, so-called, or I don't know, early factories, like in 19th century, or child labor in 19th century, or even now. So it's a frequent argument against capitalism and free market that, well, it forces all those poor Indians to work in sweatshops. It forces It forced people to work in early factories, like 16 hours a day, and suffer a lot, or in coal mines or whatever. Or it forces children right now in Congo to mine cobalt or something. But you know what? Like the argument, again, like suppose we have a free market. Like we really don't. So there might be other factors involved. But if all of that did happen on the free market, which it could, I admit that, but consider this. Those people, again, are there voluntarily. They're not there because somebody forced them to work there, right? Either in these sweatshops or in those mines in 19th century, or children like working in wherever they do or they did previously, right? So these people think that working there, wherever it is that I've listed, is better for them than not working there. And I want you to think about it, like really, really hard. Like imagine a 19th century where people were literally starving to death. And if they chose to work 16 hours a day because somebody proposed them a decent salary for that, well, like decent by their standards, so they chose it because, well, they deemed this salary to be worth it, let's say, because, well, at least their family wouldn't die of starvation, like working in agriculture, because it was horrible, even worse than working in some like manufacturers full of fumes or whatever. So they have chosen it because they thought it would be better for them. So who are you? And again, the same is true for child labor even today, because, well, if this labor helps their family to survive, like if the work in a sweatshop, like with horrible conditions of labor, helps the family of this guy or a girl or whoever it is to survive, like to get at least some money, because their country is just dirt poor. Like, who are you to make them lose their jobs? Well, you're a social democrat, you're a socialist from like Germany or United States or Australia or whatever, and you say, we should ban sweatshops, we should make those people lose their jobs and starve to death, right? So we would have our moral superiority, right? So this is what you do, basically, when you ban those things. Again, nobody forces people. Like, I agree that forcing people to work there should be banned. But that's, again, what socialists do. They force people to work. That's exactly what I'm talking about. But okay. Yeah, that was kind of a digression. I didn't mean to make it this long. Yeah, so that was the first point, basically. So nobody forced John to work at this factory, right? And the second point that is the point that I've made already in my Archimedes lever of speculation video, is that John is actually an entrepreneur himself, because, well, he has all those skills, he has whatever physical strength or expertise or whatever is needed for this particular job, right? And so in this sense, those sides in this negotiation, like employer versus John, are more equal, much more equal than Marxists usually are able to admit, let's say. So yeah, it's really just a voluntary deal of two sides. It's just a negotiation. Like, for example, like they both sides have invested in their capital, so to speak. Like the factory owner invested like a truckload of money for like having electricity and water and whatever else, like to buy the place, to build everything, and the worker invested a lot of time and perhaps money for having an education, having again physical strength, so whatever whatever you might think about. So yeah, for having all those skills. So they've both invested in whatever they're selling right now, right? An owner sells this place plus infrastructure plus capital that they've acquired, etc., whereas the worker sells their expertise and skills and so on. So yeah, well, I've had this example I wanted to make with like an owner of seeds and a provider of water, but I'm not even sure it's necessary. Like a guy bought really expensive seeds, but he needs water, so he wants to buy it from someone else who provides the water, who, let's say, invested in some water treatment plant or something. But hopefully you get the idea. They both invested something, so they now exchange on a voluntary basis again, right? Okay, so yeah, well, Marxists might say in this regard, or socialists in general, well, in order to gain capital to build factories, we should just rob people again. We should just tax them or rob them in some other way, and then we'll accumulate the capital and we'll build the factory. So is that fair? Is that cool? I don't know. I'm not sure. If it's cool for an administrator to rob you and many other people to build whatever he wants or his friends want, etc., etc. But we'll return to that point, like, where do you get your money? Again. So, and here I think is pretty clear the usual hypocrisy of socialists, that, or rather, well, it doesn't really follow from what I've said, but still I want to note this hypocrisy that monopolies of factory owners, let's say, are clearly banned. I mean, pretty much any country and even international organizations have all kinds of measures to ban monopolies, or what they call monopolies, even though already, as I've stated in my copyright video, one of the first on this channel, that monopolies only arise in interventionist systems, socialistic systems. You don't have monopolies on the free market because there's competition. So that's by definition anti-monopolistic institution. But okay, let's assume that monopolies are banned by our governments and they're doing a great job in this. Again, let's assume this is not the case, but we'll just play along. But why then? So that's the monopoly of the factory owner, right? It's banned. You cannot do that. But why aren't the monopolies of workers not banned? That's a good question, I think. Like, why aren't trade unions not banned? Because this trade union is a monopoly. So why isn't it banned? Well, because we're living in stupid socialistic society, I would claim. Like, because, well, monopoly on let's say, workforce is just the same type of monopoly as anything else. It makes stuff more expensive. Like, let's say you have a monopoly of, I don't know, taxi drivers. It means that taxi becomes more expensive for everyone, which means that all the society suffers. Maybe this small group of taxi drivers benefits from that because, well, they get extra money, they get extra privileges or whatever, but everyone else suffers. So the wealth of the society actually drops because of that, because it's only the small group that accumulates some extra wealth from everyone else. But again, since it's a small group, like, everyone else suffers. So yeah, why isn't that banned? Why aren't trade unions considered as monopolies, which they are, is really baffling, and it's really illogical, but that's socialism for you, right? And I'm not even talking about the outright criminal activities of trade unions, of which history knows quite a lot, but that's a different subject again. Yeah, so okay, that were another, all this mutually beneficial deal between the factory owner and, I mean, in the free market system, between the owner and the employee, it leads to growth of wealth for everyone, because again, it's voluntary. So in the end, it produces goods that the owner would sell to somebody, the third person, and they would benefit also, because it's also a voluntary deal of buying these goods, right? So where's cruelty, unfairness, or whatever here? That's a good question, I would say. So everyone in this chain benefits. And I would say that it's not actually a chain, it's more like a network, you know, like a, again, network of power, as I've stated multiple times, pretty much like what Bruno Latour talks about, how these networks organize, etc. Although Latour talks about science, but here we have economy, it's more or less the same thing. Again, everything is will to power, right? And so, in this regard, I might recommend you to read Leonard Read, who wrote a brilliant essay called I, Pencil, where he describes like how pencil was made, from the first person being a pencil, like how many people actually aligned their wills to power, so to speak, how many people cooperated in producing a pencil just through market mechanisms. Like, I'm sorry, like a wood for a pencil might have been produced in Siberia or Amazon or whatever, and then a metal for it might have been made in Pennsylvania or whatever, and the ore might have been mined in someplace else, and all the workers also participated, and all the sellers participated, and all the transport companies participated. So it's like a huge network that virtually encompasses all of the society just for this one pencil to be produced. So it's almost miraculous self-organizing power of the market. That's basically what we're dealing with here. This spontaneous order that market produces. These voluntary interactions. So, and everyone benefits from that, because every link in this network, every node, has their own interests, but they are willing to participate in all of that, you know. So it's this amazing harmony, if you like. It's this most natural and effective way of organizing those wills to power. It's the free market, essentially, to arrange those power ensembles, and it gives more power to everyone, more power to to every human being, and all the humanity works as this amazing orchestra, basically. Okay, I've kind of talked too much about that probably, but it's really worth thinking about. And well, in general, I would say that no one has to provide for anyone else for free, you know, like even basic things like food and shelter. Like, no one has to. They might, but they don't have to, right? So they might exchange those goods and services for something useful to them, like what they would be willing to exchange for food and shelter, let's say, or anything else really. But they don't have to. And this is the only civilized approach to economy that I can think of, I might say. And by the way, here I was thinking about the Christian roots of individualism and capitalism also, or free market. And, you know, it's like, I would say that it's definitely true. Like, Christian culture seems to be the one that produces this type of approach. Because, it's individualistic, fundamentally. Like the idea of fundamental rights, the property rights, for example, I can't think of any other religion or philosophical system that would be as strong as Christianity in this regard. in the sense that, well, in the sense of individualism, basically. But okay, that's a very long discussion. But one thing I wanted to note here is that it's frequently said, or at least sometimes said, following Max Weber, this German sociologist, this idea that from his book, how was it called? Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, something like that. That, capitalism is all about Protestantism. But I would actually disagree quite heavily here, because from what I know, actually most of the most prominent thinkers, like free market oriented thinkers, are actually Catholic. They're not Protestant at all. Like you might think about School of Salamanca in Spain, what is now called Spain. Back then it was like part of the Roman Empire in the 16th century. Or you might think about, again, French physiocrats, whom I've already mentioned in one of my videos. Or you might think about the Austrian economic school, that's again a Catholic country. Or you might think about, well, even Adam Smith is from Scotland, which is kind of Catholic, if I'm not mistaken. Even though, as I've already said, he basically stolen all of his best ideas from French physiocrats. So yeah. So I'm not stating that all of those thinkers were actually Catholic, but they're definitely from Catholic environment, let's say. All right. So it's another interesting topic for discussion, I believe. But anyway, let's return to our debate about fairness of socialism versus free market. So some social justice advocate, I'm not saying warrior because that's a bit different. So some social justice advocate might say, well, John actually should share his cabbage, because, well, otherwise the poor and the depraved, they would suffer and maybe die and be miserable or something, right? And the question is, why wouldn't they, these poor and deprived and hungry, grow their own cabbage? Like, who prohibits that? Again, see my note in the comments for the previous video. I actually messed up prohibit and permit. So who prohibits those people to grow their own cabbage? Why wouldn't they do something useful to other people to exchange it, whatever they've done, for their cabbage or whatever other things they might need? That's a good question, I think. Well, actually, you might say, and that's another important remark here, is that governments of today actually do quite a lot to prohibit people from doing something useful. Like, they would prohibit you doing business by many, many means, by regulations, again, taxes. Like, you must do all kinds of stuff just to do anything today, right? So that's one way of prohibition. And another way is, again, addressing workers themselves. Like, governments regulate the workforce quite a lot, One good example would be, for example, minimum wage. Like, government forces the employers to pay only more than a certain extent. It's basically the same idea as eliminating sweatshops or something like that. So what that leads to unemployment. So people cannot work and earn their money. They cannot be useful for society because, well, government placed this minimal wage. So you cannot hire them if let's say, you deem their work less valuable than the minimum wage, which it might actually be, So you're forcing people into unemployment by minimum wage. Is that a good thing? You're forcing them to starve, essentially. I mean, obviously, you have other socialistic mechanisms to feed them, again, by forcibly taking resources away from other people. But is that good? Like, you're you're basically forcing one people to starve, then forcing other people to feed them. That's basically what you're doing. That's brilliant, I would say. Okay, that's what socialists do. Yeah, again, I got kind of distracted by this intermission, so to speak. Okay, but on the free market, those people can. I mean, those poor and hungry and deprived people, they can do something good for others, right? Well, you might say, well, what if they're completely useless? Like they're paralyzed, like blind and deaf. Like what would they do? Well, in this case, I would say there are charities. Like people might and actually do voluntarily donate to charity. And like throughout all of the history, charity existed. Right now, it's very suppressed, especially in socialistic countries, because of all the regulations, first and foremost, and secondly, because the societies where socialism is a predominant force, they're much poorer, so they cannot even donate anything to charity, right? Well, okay, it's a whole separate discussion. Let's move on. So, I would say that to force John to provide for people who didn't do anything useful, even though they could have, in the free market system at least, is actually unfair, you know? Like, but let's imagine if he actually was forced to, like, let's say, feed a guy who didn't do anything at all for other people, okay? Well, obviously the guy would be happy because, well, he just got some food from nowhere, you know? But he didn't do anything to get this food. So, de facto, like, everything boils down to the situation where we have a system that has punished John, a guy who produced something of value, the cabbage, so he increased the wealth of the society by producing these new goods. And at the same time, it fosters a guy who didn't do anything useful to other people at all. So you have a system that punishes, roughly speaking, good people and elevates, roughly speaking, bad people. Where by good people, I mean people who increase the wealth of society, and by bad people, I mean people who don't do anything good to others at all, right? So is that a good system? Like, is that a fair system? Do you think that kind of system would bring you to prosperity? Like, think about it. If you suppress productive people and elevate unproductive people, what would you get in the end? That's a good question, I believe. And okay, let's go to probably the last and main point I wanted to make today, is that, well, it's frequently said that market is social Darwinism, you know, where, again, weak and poor people die, and only the cheerful and strong survive and succeed, or maybe even the evil and sinister people succeed. So I would agree with the main claim that capitalism or free market is social Darwinism, but I would completely disagree with this, let's say, particularities. So let me explain what I mean here. I would say that capitalism or free market kills or gets rid of not people, those supposedly weak and whatever, deprived people, but it gets rid of types of behavior, certain types of behavior. That's what it does. In particular, free market punishes incompetence, it punishes parasitism, it punishes idling and any sort of antisocial behavior, etc., etc. That's what it does. It only allows those types of behavior which other people are interested in. That's what free market is all about, fundamentally. So, again, interested in on a voluntary basis, right? So, roughly speaking, other people are ready to pay for it, right? I mean, just in a very pragmatic sense. So it leads to optimal distribution of goods, of wealth. I mean, this type of system. So it forces you, in some sense, or at least incentivizes you to make as much good to each other as you can. I mean, to others and vice versa. So what Friedrich Hayek called the best ways to serve one another, you know, and cooperate, again, to get in exchange from those other people with whom you cooperate with, or to whom you're doing some good, something that you value also, you know. So again, to make this deal mutually beneficial, because otherwise you wouldn't participate in it in the first place. So again, where's the unfairness in that? Where's the cruelty? I don't know. Like really, it eludes me completely. And again, the point I've tried to make previously, which I've saved for now, is that I believe that, and I think I've made this point previously in one of my videos, but I don't quite remember which one. Maybe Archimedes' Lever of Speculation, because there I've talked about money systems. So I wish to, again, reiterate this idea that, in my opinion, money is just information about how much good you did to others. And that's all. In free market, I mean. So you do something good to somebody, they give you money in exchange for that. That's it. Nothing else. So by looking at the flow of money, you can determine, I mean, if you're an entrepreneur, let's say, you would think, what should I do? Like, I have some resources, like, let's say, my own skills. What should I do? So you look at where the money flows, and you say, aha, that's what people need. That's what brings them good. So I'll make that. And obviously it all is tied to the supply and demand law. So because where there's more money, it means there's less supply and more demand. So as entrepreneur moves in there, he increases the supply, and demand gets more satisfied. So the prices lower a little bit. So it balances itself out. The whole system is in dynamic equilibrium. Essentially, but it's such a basic thing. I mean, everyone should know that. Hopefully, at least you know that. But if you didn't, hopefully, at least from now, you would. But okay, what was I talking about? Damn. Okay, yeah. So money is information about the amount of good you did to somebody else, to other people in general. But that's on the free market. But obviously, as I've mentioned in my video about Archimedes' Lever of Speculation, the money systems were corrupted by government. So now we have government monopoly on money. And so now it's not guaranteed, let's say, that the money is the amount of good, is equivalent to the amount of good that you made to others. Like, you might receive money from the government, so that's basically a money that were robbed, like that the other people were robbed of by the government. So it's not guaranteed that those 100 people, or how many there are, who make the decision to give this money to you, that they're just, you know, that they represent the people who are being robbed by them by this particular act, right? It's not guaranteed at all, I would say. Or again, just printing money, which again robs everyone in the society through inflation and Cantillon effect that I've talked about in my video about speculation. But okay, let's just finish that. I just said that, yeah, in current day and age, which is not free market at all. Money is not what it should be on a free market, right? That's what I'm saying. And in purely socialistic systems, money actually can have completely just decorative function. Like in many socialistic regimes, you for example, money gets abolished at some points. For example, you can just have ration stamps, like in Soviet Union, like in North Korea, etc. So you just get a piece of paper that says, well, you can get 1 leaf of bread or something like that, you know, or like 2 eggs or something. Or you might think of modern socialistic United States, where you have food stamps, etc. So yeah, money is not really big of a deal when you have a monopoly on money, you know. But at the same time, obviously, as I've already mentioned in my previous videos, it brings up many problems. Like if you regulate your prices or just straight up set them, you know, by administrative means, it makes economic calculation impossible. Again, this theorem of Mises of socialism and economic calculation from his book Socialism from 1922, where he claims that if you control prices, you cannot determine, again, this supply and demand. You ruin this dynamic equilibrium that I was talking about. You make it impossible for people to determine what is best for them to do to better serve other people. Again, speaking in Friedrich Hayek's terms. So yeah, that's a brilliant idea, right? Let's ruin the whole economy. Let's disorient people completely. Let's redistribute the flow of money so that people would be fooled and they would go to this area where we've put a lot of money, and because they think there's more demand there, whereas this demand was actually controlled by the government. So it's a completely artificial demand. It's not demanded by people, it's demanded by some lobbyists and like 100 congressmen or whatever. So yeah, I think I've talked about this enough. So you get a completely screwed economic system. So the society as a whole and the production gets deteriorated, and it deviates from the needs of people because, well, the economy gets fooled by those false signals from the government, essentially. And plus, obviously, this system, I mean, socialistic system, enforces this unproductive types of behavior that I've talked about. All the idling, all the parasitism, etc. And as an example, you might think about the black crime in US, for example, where, well, basically one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason I would claim, for this horrible inequality, let's say, in the amount of crime between blacks and all the other ethnicities in the US is the demolition of the family in the 60s. Like, well, again, if you look at the government expenditures by this new welfare state that was established in the US in the 60s, and perhaps a little bit before that, but mostly in the 60s. So the government expenditures in the US and single motherhood in the US correlate almost perfectly, right? So what it means, well, okay, I've talked about that in gender video, how welfare state basically substituted nuclear family in terms of redistribution of wealth from men to women, right? So bottom line, like from this particular example of mine, is that the government disincentivized black women to stay married to black men because, well, mostly for historical reasons, such as the lack of education, etc., etc., black men couldn't earn a lot of money, right? And it's quite understandable. I mean, it's the 60s. Whereas the government gave black women a lot of money I mean, in comparison, right? So they were incentivized to divorce their husbands because of welfare state, because of this artificial, again, it's the change of consumer preferences, if you like, whereby consumer here, I mean, wife, I mean, either she consumes her husband, so to speak, roughly speaking, or she consumes welfare. So she, how do you say, prefers, or many of those people prefer to consume welfare. And so you have all those broken families, single mother families. And so all those children become screwed because of that. Well, it's not a big miracle. I mean, how do you say? Well, okay, broken families are like the perfect incubator for trouble, for crime in particular. And again, so that's why you get those. Well, other reason was the birth control introduced in 1960. So that also led to a lot of divorces, well, because it wasn't used properly, etc., etc. So you've had all those broken families, and a lot of them were black, right? So that's the reason for the whole discrepancy, this racial discrepancy in crime in the U.S. and many other countries, I would say. And you have those spikes, like almost exactly like 20 years after, like roughly. There was like one peak in 1970, I think, one peak in 1980, even a bigger one. So that's almost like 20 years after, you know, the introduction of birth control and start of welfare state. So that's enough time for these broken families to give fruit, so to speak, right? Young men from broken families. So that's a perfect recipe for crime. And let's thank socialists, social democrats, welfare state for that, right? For, again, this another point for white supremacists, that it's all blacks' fault, right? And another point for black supremacists, that whites keep blaming them for all the crimes because they're black, not because they're from broken families, at least a lot of them. Okay, let's go to the conclusion, I guess. So, yeah, the point that I've made near the end is that indeed I would claim that free market is indeed a social Darwinism, but the devil in the details, so to speak. During the evolution, it's not the societies or particular people that are selected, but types of behavior. Types of behavior are getting selected. And it's interesting that, well, it's my general conclusion, pretty much, period. But it's interesting that like a week after I wrote this essay, which is like from 2017, I think, I've read an article at FEE.org, that's Foundation for Economic Education, I guess, which was, curiously enough, founded by Leonard Read, whom I've already mentioned here with regards to his essay, I Pencil. So anyway, so this FEE.org article was called Why Laissez-faire is not social Darwinism, and by the way, it's interesting that I was talking about fairness, right? And laissez-faire, which means like let go, so to speak. It's almost like laissez-faire, you know. That's unique. Bonus content, you know. Okay, so in this article, as far as I remember, socialistic system or any other system was actually also named as social Darwinistic, so to speak. But the thing is, the point was in this article that the context of selection, so to speak, is different in those other types of systems, not in the market system. I mean, with respect to the market system, they're different. So, and I would claim with regards to that. And perhaps that was the conclusion of the article. I don't quite remember, but that would be my conclusion in conjunction to this article, is that, and my own conclusion that I've already made, is that socialistic system violently selects unproductive types of behavior, while market system voluntarily selects productive ones. So that's more or less your choice, which one you wish to follow. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.